My company refused to pay me. Then their auditor called. I have always believed that the people who keep the lights on in a company are rarely the ones whose names end up on the plaques in the lobby. I spent 11 years at Mercer and Holt Financial Services doing exactly that, keeping the lights on. My title was Senior Payroll and Compensation Analyst, which sounds impressive until you understand that it essentially meant I was the person responsible for making sure 412 employees received accurate paychecks every 2 weeks without fail, that our benefits calculations aligned with federal and state reporting requirements, and that every number we submitted to outside auditors could be traced back to a source document with a clean, unbroken chain of logic. I was good at my job. I was very, very good at my job. And that, as it turns out, is precisely what made what happened to me so ironic. It started with a promotion that wasn't a promotion. In the spring of 3 years ago, my direct supervisor, a man named Gerald Whitmore, announced that he was transitioning into a newly created role overseeing benefits strategy across the entire parent company. That left his position, Director of Payroll Operations, vacant. I had been functioning in that capacity in everything but name for the better part of 2 years. I ran the team meetings. I handled escalations. I was the one the CFO's office contacted when they needed a reconciliation done on short notice. Everyone in the building knew who was actually doing that job. So when Gerald told me that leadership was planning to post the position internally first and that he intended to recommend me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time at that company. I felt seen. What I did not feel, and what I should have insisted upon before I let another week go by, was any of that in writing. Gerald left in June. I stepped into the director's responsibilities fully. I was running the department, managing 3 analysts beneath me, representing payroll in the quarterly finance review meetings, and signing off on every submission that went to our third-party compliance vendor. I was doing the job. The only thing I wasn't doing was receiving the salary that came with it. When I asked HR about the formal reclassification, I was told that the position was still being evaluated at the leadership level and that these things took time. When I followed up a month later, I was told that there had been some restructuring conversations happening at the executive level and that payroll director responsibilities might be absorbed into a broader operations role. When I followed up again in September, I was told that the company had decided to hire externally. They hired a man named Todd Fenwick. He had 7 years of experience, which was 4 fewer than mine. He had never managed a team larger than 2 people. He had no background in the specific compliance frameworks our company operated under, which were not standard and which had taken me the better part of a year to fully master when I first joined. His starting salary was listed in a document I was not supposed to see but did, because I process payroll and sometimes documents find their way into folders they were not intended to occupy. He was being paid $31,000 more per year than I was. He was being paid more than Gerald had been paid, and I had been doing the job for 4 months without $1 of additional compensation. I sat with that number for 3 days before I decided what to do with it. I want to be honest about those 3 days, because I think it matters to tell this part truthfully. I was angry in a way I hadn't been in years. Not the hot, surface kind of angry that makes you fire off an email you'll regret. This was the other kind. The cold, clarifying kind that sits in your chest and makes everything around it very quiet and very sharp. I thought about walking into my new manager's office and telling him exactly what I knew. I thought about going to HR with a prepared statement. I thought about updating my resume that night and being gone before the end of the month. I did all of those things in my head, in various combinations, in various sequences. And then on the 3rd day I sat down and I thought about what I actually knew, what I could actually prove, and what the most effective use of that information would be. What I knew was this. I had performed the duties of a director-level role for a period of approximately 4 months. That was documented in every meeting agenda, every email thread, every report that bore my name. I had not been compensated at the director level during that time. That was documented in my pay stubs and in the payroll system I personally administered. The person hired to fill the role I had been performing was being compensated at a rate significantly higher than mine despite having materially less relevant experience and qualification. That was documented, though not in a way the company would be comfortable knowing I had accessed. And the decision to pass over me had been made without any formal evaluation process, any posted job description, any panel interview, or any written notification of the outcome. I did not make a scene. What I did instead was make a file. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented everything I could document from sources I had legitimate access to. I pulled every email where I had been addressed in my acting director capacity. I compiled every meeting where I had represented the department to senior leadership. I created a clean, dated log of every conversation I had been part of regarding the transition of Gerald's responsibilities. I noted the names of the people present, the substance of what was discussed, and any commitments that had been made, however informally. I was careful. I was thorough. And I was still doing my job at full capacity the entire time, because whatever was happening around me, I was not going to give anyone a legitimate reason to question my performance. I also, during this period, scheduled a consultation with an employment attorney. Her name was Diane Voss, and she had spent 20 years in labor and employment law with a focus on wage and discrimination claims. I found her through a referral from a friend who had used her firm for an unrelated matter. I told her everything I just told you, and I brought the file I had compiled, and I sat across from her in a conference room and watched her read through it with the kind of quiet focus that I recognized because it was the same thing I did when I was reviewing a discrepancy in our compliance submissions. When she looked up, she said a number of things that I found useful. She told me that I likely had a viable claim for unpaid wages for the period during which I had been performing director-level duties without commensurate compensation. She told me that the compensation gap between me and Todd Fenwick, combined with the circumstances of the hiring decision, was worth examining under equal pay statutes. She told me that what I had in my file was more than most people walk in with. She also told me to stop talking about any of this to anyone at work, to continue documenting contemporaneously, and to be very careful about how I had obtained the salary information I had mentioned. That last point I took seriously. I made a decision in that meeting to build my case only on information I could access through my normal job functions, which was, it turned out, quite a lot. I went back to work. I continued doing my job, which now included training Todd Fenwick on the compliance frameworks he did not understand, because that had been assigned to me as part of my role. I want you to understand what that felt like. I want you to sit with the image of me walking him through the methodology I had developed over years, explaining the logic behind documentation standards I had built, watching him nod and take notes, and occasionally ask questions that confirmed he had far less context than the title on his org chart suggested. I did it without complaint. I did it professionally and thoroughly. And the entire time I was doing it, I was also keeping notes on what I was training him on, how long it took, and what it demonstrated about the gap between his existing knowledge and the requirements of the role. The audit was announced in November. Every few years our company underwent a comprehensive compensation and compliance audit conducted by an independent third-party firm. It was not unusual. It was not triggered by anything specific, as far as I knew at the time. It was a routine engagement that our CFO had mentioned at the quarterly review in passing. The auditing firm sent over a preliminary information request, and because payroll fell under my operational purview, I was the one who coordinated the response. I pulled together the requested documentation. I organized it carefully. I submitted it through the proper channels. And then I went back to my desk and I waited, because I had been doing this long enough to know that auditors always have follow-up questions, and that the follow-up questions are always more interesting than the initial request. The auditor who called me was a woman named Patricia Chung. She reached out to me directly, which was a little unusual. Typically, those calls would have been routed through Todd or through someone in the CFO's office. But she had been given my name as the primary point of contact for payroll operations, which was accurate, and she had questions about several areas of the documentation I had submitted. We had an initial call of about 40 minutes. She was precise and methodical, and I liked her immediately because she asked the kind of questions that suggested she already knew what the answers were going to be and was checking to see whether what I told her matched. About 2/3 of the way through that call, she paused and said something that I had not been expecting. She said that as part of their compensation analysis, they had been reviewing internal role equivalencies, and that there were some anomalies in the data that she wanted to walk through with me. She asked me to confirm whether my job duties during the period from June through September had included a specific set of responsibilities that she read from a list. The list was, item by item, a description of the director-level functions I had been performing. I confirmed that it was accurate. She asked me how my compensation during that period compared to the established pay band for the director classification. I told her that my compensation had not changed during that period. She thanked me, said she might have additional questions, and ended the call. 3 days later, she called again. This time she asked if I would be willing to provide documentation of the duties I had been performing during that window, including any records that might indicate how those duties had been assigned or communicated. I told her I had documentation. She asked me to submit it directly to her, which I did. I sent everything I had compiled, every email, every meeting agenda, every report I had signed off on in that acting capacity. I sent it through a secure upload portal she provided. I noted in my cover message that the materials were being provided in connection with the audit review and that I was available for any follow-up questions she might have. I did not hear from the company's leadership about any of this for 11 days. On the 12th day, I was called into a meeting with the VP of Human Resources, a woman named Sandra Chu, who had always been pleasant to me in the abstract way that HR leaders are pleasant to everyone until they need to be otherwise. She was joined by the company's general counsel, a man I had met only twice before, and by someone I did not recognize who was introduced to me as a representative from the executive team. Sandra told me that the company had been made aware through the audit process of certain questions regarding my compensation history and role classification, and that they wanted to discuss a resolution. She used the word resolution, not correction, not acknowledgement, resolution. I had spoken with Diane before this meeting. I knew exactly what I was willing to say and what I was going to let them say first. They offered me a reclassification to a newly created senior director title. They offered a salary adjustment that was substantial. They offered a retroactive payment covering what they described as a pay period discrepancy, which was a careful way of saying they were paying me for the 4 months of director-level work I had done without director-level pay. Sandra presented all of this in a tone that suggested they were doing me a favor. I sat across from her with my hands folded on the table, and I let her finish every word. Then I told her I would need to review the written offer with my attorney before responding, and that I would be in touch by the end of the week. The expression on the face of the man from the executive team shifted in a way I found quietly satisfying. I did not think they had expected me to have an attorney. People like me, in roles like mine, at levels like mine, we are not supposed to have attorneys. We are supposed to be grateful. We are supposed to sign things and feel relieved and go back to our desks and keep the lights on. Diane reviewed the offer, and we went back with a counterproposal that addressed several items they had not initially included, specifically a formal acknowledgement in writing that my compensation during the acting director period had been misclassified, a documented commitment to a standard review cycle at the new title level, and a provision related to my attorney's fees for the consultation process. The back and forth took 9 days. There were 2 phone calls between Diane and their general counsel. There was a moment, on the second call, where I was told later the general counsel had made an oblique reference to the sensitivity of certain documents and how they had made their way to the auditor. Diane had responded by noting that her client had submitted documentation in direct response to an auditor's formal request during an authorized review process, which was both accurate and legally unimpeachable, and that she looked forward to resolving the matter amicably. We settled. I cannot share the full terms because I signed a confidentiality agreement, and I made the decision that the full package they offered was worth that agreement. What I can tell you is that I was made financially whole for the period I was not compensated appropriately. I can tell you that my new salary reflected what the role I was actually doing was worth in the market. I can tell you that the written acknowledgement I had asked for was included, worded carefully but clearly, in the settlement documentation. I want to tell you something about Todd Fenwick because I think about him sometimes when I think about this story. I did not take any action that targeted him. He had not wronged me. He had taken a job, he was offered at a salary he was quoted, and none of that was his fault. He left the company about 8 months after I settled, of his own volition, for a role at a different firm. I heard through someone on my team that the transition had not gone particularly smoothly. I did not feel victorious about that. I felt tired in the way you feel when something complicated finally stops being your problem. What I did feel victorious about, if that's even the right word, was something quieter than that. It was the 11 years I had spent becoming someone who could not be dismissed without consequences. It was the file I had built, methodically and patiently, from sources I had every right to access. It was the way I had walked into that meeting with Sandra Chu and not said a single thing I would later regret. It was Diane's voice on the phone the day after we reached agreement, telling me that I had been one of the most prepared clients she had worked with, that most people come in with a feeling, and I had come in with a record. I still work in compensation and payroll. I am still, at my core, the person who makes sure the numbers are right and the documentation is clean, and the people who depend on this function can trust that it works. I have not stopped being that person. What I have added to that person is a complete and total understanding of the fact that the systems I know how to operate, the documentation, the compliance requirements, the audit processes, the paper trails, those systems do not only exist to protect the company. They exist to protect anyone who is willing to learn how to use them. The auditor called because the numbers didn't add up. I had made sure of that a long time before she ever dialed my number.